Right, so the recording is now switched on. So good afternoon, or good day, I should say, everyone, depending whereabouts you are in the world. Welcome to our call, our weekly call after a 1 week hiatus for the delights of IETF 110. So the main focus of the call today is for those of us that did attend. We're just going to see what stood out content-wise from some of the sessions that we variously joined. And by way of a visual aid, if I can find the right screen, I will pop this on for you. So if I share my screen just momentarily. So hopefully you can see on your screens just a listing of some of the sessions that caught my eye from last week. And you'll see I've just listed there very simply the name of the session and, where appropriate, a little hint as to what it was that I thought made it noteworthy. I'll give you a moment to scan down that, and you'll see and I posted this in the chat a short while ago. You'll see I've put a URL at the bottom. So if you have a particular interest to look at any of that content, and don't especially want to go to the agenda on the IETF website, you can just click on the link, and that will take you basically to a web page with those sessions on it, with links just to the sort of agenda material, as well as a link to the YouTube video, just to save a little bit of time if you're not overly familiar with the IETF website. Not that it's complicated to navigate to that on the website either, to be fair, but might save you a moment or two. But what I thought we would do is maybe start off with the ADD session, which I think warrants particular attention for all the obvious reasons. And then, as time permits, as well as people's interest, you maybe touch on some of the other sessions as appropriate, and see where that discussion takes us. But I'll be equally interested in anything else that anybody else noted as well, so we don't have to stick to that list. So just going back to sort of normal view then, if we start with the two ADD sessions, which I think were well attended. If I recall, I think we had over 100 people at each of the two of those. I can't remember the exact number. And a wealth of material, Glenn and others that were there. Should I ask, so I'm getting heckled on email for choice of words, but anyway, should ask perhaps Glenn, in terms of just your impressions as co-chair, whether anything particularly stood out in the two sessions for you, and then maybe see from others that were there what their sort of reactions were.
Well, I think my one big takeaway is that if we schedule ADD against SAG, that it actually provides a means for the ADD group to actually not want to talk and talk and talk and talk. And I think it's the first time we've ever ended a session early because the group ran out of topics that they wanted to go at, which I think is a good sign. It means we're maturing along some solutions that are in the drafts there, and we're starting to chill a little bit. So I think that's a positive outcome. I thought the sessions went well. Certainly, I think at one point I looked over at session number 1. We had about 166 or 180 people, so it was a pretty big thing. I haven't looked at the blue sheets for session 2. It was slightly less well attended, I think, because I think we were up against some other groups like SAG, and also for the West Coast United States, it was several hours earlier than the other session, which was more mid-morning or early morning for us. And so I think there's people that, if you're on the fence of do I get up at 4 a.m. to go talk about DNS discovery, there's some of us who will say yes, and there's some of us who will make a better decision and say no. So, but I think overall it's good. I just uploaded the minutes from the minute takers into the data tracker. So if people want to take a look at the minutes and follow along if they haven't already done, they are now posted. No big issues. There's no big flames that we're engaged on during the discussion. I think coming out of the discussion, everyone seems to be a little bit tired. I've noticed the drop off of the mailing lists in general for the IETF over the weekend. But clearly, there's some heat starting to generate up around the enterprise split DNS VPN world, and some proposals there. We got some different viewpoints on, what's the trust level of the network? How should it be communicated? Should it be communicated at all? Which are typical ADD type hand-wringing discussions we'll have. But we'll get there. We've been a good group, I think, over the last year, made a lot of progress. So that's my thoughts. So I'll shut up.
Fair enough. I think that covered quite a lot of ground there. That was very information rich, Glenn. And I must admit, I sympathise in terms of the time zone. Well, mind you, I think possibly for West Coast US, it's better this time than it was IETF 109 when you sort of.
Oh yeah, I said I shut up on I lied. I would say both of them were about 9 hours difference. They're both painful. But this was maybe a little less painful. I am looking forward to Payback, which is IETF 111, which is going to be in my time zone. Awesome.
Yes. It comes around 1 in 3 times, which is good. So I can see we got a fair few people on the call that were also on both of those sessions last week. So anyone else want to jump in with your reflections on the either of the 2 ADD sessions? In terms of any particular points that you thought were of interest. I can see Ralph has preempted that by raising his hand first, which is very impressive, Ralph. So yes, please, others raise hands if you're able on Zoom. If not, by all means, either raise your hand in the chat or put a comment in the chat and I'll read it out. But Ralph, over to you first.
Yeah, I would echo what Glenn has said. The 2 sessions were very productive, and currently I'm a bit more concerned about the mailing list than the sessions, but I think overall we've made good progress. The only concern I currently have is that for the DDR stuff, I think we decided to not cover the 85% case just to make it easy. And I mean, there's a provision in that draft for an opportunistic auto upgrade, which I think is good if your router can be upgraded. And it looks like Ben is now wanting to reopen that. So I'd rather have that done without that and then maybe have a second draft finished, because we need to finish at some point. And I fear that, I mean, this has been taken on and off. Again, that if we continue that discussion, then will take longer. I mean, the DNR, there's, I mean, what I would say, well, not bike shedding there at the moment. What do we put in the record and how? But it's progressing nicely. So yeah, overall good stuff.
So just to be clear on that, Ralph, so you'd rather that get them the right way around, DDR wasn't amended along the lines of the suggestion from Ben to provide support for some
right.
DNS forwarders and private IP addresses. Then,
Yeah, and I think my personal view on this, it's nearly impossible to add that in a secure way. And I'd rather have a world where DNR, like the DHCP server, gives you that kind of information where to go, rather than having, the DDR stuff is a kind of a shortcut before we can get all the CPs upgraded, pretty much, or all the network equipment upgraded.
So you
And
prefer something
as a
more
shortcut, we
streamlined.
need to finish it fast, so to speak, and then let the DNR stuff do its stuff and roll out our network. Yeah.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you, Ralph. Chris, did you have
Yes.
thoughts on that?
I raised my hand because I wanted to disagree with Ralph. So, Ben's pull request is pull request 11. If anyone wants to look it up, I think it is important to include for the reason that we need. I think it's important to have the ability to upgrade the 85% to encrypted DNS. And I take your point that it's not as good as DNR. And I'm not saying we should treat them as equivalent, because the upgrading to encrypted DNS for the 85% case, which is like old home routers on a private IP address, it does provide benefit, and clients wouldn't be treating that as better than authenticated DNS. The clients will be well aware that it's not as good, and so that when people do swap their home routers for a newer one, the clients can detect and upgrade from that point to a new, more secure mode of operation. But my concern is if we leave it out, we either end up with a situation where most people aren't benefiting from encrypted DNS, or there are bodges or proprietary solutions that go in, or traffic is tunneled to the cloud, in order that there is some way of doing encrypted DNS. So my preference is certainly to include that in DDR. I think we should merge the PR, and if people don't think we should merge the PR, obviously they can raise the reasons why. But personally, I would say the reason, it being not as good as the other options, I don't see that as a reason to exclude it entirely.
Yeah, fair enough. And before I go to Glenn next, I will refer anyone to the IETF plenary if you want to listen to a reasonably short discussion as to whether and how to use GitHub, and the purpose of using GitHub for discussion versus the email lists, which I have to say in the second ADD session, our co-chairs were very diligent in requesting that people put the substantive points in the mailing list, which was much appreciated. But Glenn, anyway, over to you first, and then back to Ralph.
Yeah, so boy, a lot of stuff to cover there. So let me, not in any particular order. So wearing my chair hat, let me say the following things. Ralph, number one, I have not yet heard consensus on that we should not include these things in DDR. So I think the group at the moment is still open to where the DDR stuff has pull stuff in, and the fact that Ben it has that pull request open for it, and that there's ongoing conversations around it. I think that there's not yet consensus within the group that we should sort of say, 90% or 85% not in, but we're going to solve this 15%. So I think that we're not there yet. On GitHub discussions, I'm very sensitive to this issue, but I think all working group chairs should be. The primary discussion for the IETF is to be done on the mailing lists. That's where Tail and I are going to turn to and listen to for consensus discussions. and of course the meetings. So this is going to be an ongoing thing. With GitHub's a wonderful tool. It really is a wonderful tool. It helps us a lot in crafting documents, but we got to be very sensitive never to create a two-tiered approach where we have one group making decisions over in GitHub that are all GitHub very savvy, and then we exclude the people that are on the mailing list. That's an ongoing problem. And the only thing I can say as a chair is I'm very sensitive to that. I'm going to keep a very close watch on that and do whatever I can along the way to make sure those groups stay together in lockstep, working together. And I'm not going to back off on that one. Okay, so now with my hat off, chair hat off, I think that it's sort of a blend of this. As somebody who helped write the charter and somebody who's a great proponent for creating the ADD group myself, I did that personally because I thought that we have a big problem that needs to be solved of how to do discovery. We've got several different discovery mechanisms that are deployed by the browsers. They're not, consistent or even well understood by all the people using them because they're not documented in a standard way. If we don't ultimately produce a solution that solves a usable case that covers, it doesn't have to be 100% of the users, but a preponderance of the users, then I think we will have failed as a working group because the internet needs a consistent way for the majority of people to have a way to do discovery and upgrade. It's just we need it, and that's why we did this in the first place. And if we sort of say, let's take the easy route, well, we already have the easy route, right? Jason Livingood and Ecker documented the approach Mozilla is using in a sort of a very very tiny little ID they put out there. That's the easy route. It doesn't solve it for everybody, and we need to stay the course. It's hard, but that's the ultimate goal of trying to, in a reasonable amount of time, get something that solves for the preponderance of people. And with that, again, I'll shut up.
Thanks, Glenn. And it occurred to me, for those that are not following the IETF discussions as closely, the references to DDR are not the former East Germany, but they are in fact one of the proposed discovery methods. And the 85% discussion, it was a sort of shorthand for references to the need to accommodate the architecture that's particularly commonplace in Europe in a lot of fixed networks, which is a combination of private IP addresses on devices and the use of DNS forwarders, so from homes into typically a closed resolver operated by an ISP. So the need to provide a discovery mechanism that supports that architecture, which the DDR discovery mechanism as proposed by a number of authors doesn't currently support that, but a modification has been proposed that potentially would enable it to do so. With that, I'll shut up, and hopefully that made a little bit of sense, and hand over to Ralph.
Yeah, so the concern I have with doing this upgrade, I mean, we had an earlier proposal that came out of this group that did the 85% upgrade, but with the caveat that the servers are public. Now, this was kind of rejected, and we went back to the drawing board. The problem I have with having an upgrade mechanism that goes out of sort of the realms of the public IP address is that in this scenario, there's a greater security risk that someone can intercept and direct you somewhere. And B, the bigger risk is that most of the upgrade mechanisms are currently done by applications. So if we sort of have a newer version of, say, Chrome on an older operating system that does not support having the DNR information from the network, that might be different, then this could auto upgrade somewhere where I don't want it to. And that's why I think my personal view on this, and I certainly want to track that, I want to tackle that problem, but I think it's better if we have both drafts in a reasonable amount of time and then get people to implement them, because the end goal for me is still to have the operating system reside on DNS, and then tell its applications. And that is done with DNR and not DDR.
Fair comment. Again, just for completeness, the references to DNR, for those of you certainly from the UK, is not a reference to do not resuscitate, which is a bad thing if you happen to find yourself in hospital and see that at the end of your bed. It's an alternate discovery mechanism, which was designed, I think, from day one to support.
It's not internal, it's additional.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. So there could be complementary options. I see that's possibly I've misspoken, and Glenn has raised his hand to jump back in.
I have. So Andrew, I'm wondering, this is a suggestion, not a commitment for anybody. You know, given that we have there's an overlap here of people that are attending the IETF, but people that aren't, and sensitive to that. It might be useful at a future one of these calls if you could arrange for somebody, not me, to come talk about what is being proposed in the DDR draft and what is being proposed in the DNR draft, to give people a sort of a summary, a sense of it. Again, not me. I'm the chair, so it wouldn't be inappropriate for me to try to do that.
It's one of the one occasion where you're really pleased you're the chair, Glenn.
Absolutely.
I think for some of us who haven't had time to be in the IETF as much as we would like to be, that summary would be really useful.
Okay, duly noted. I'll see if I can rustle up a volunteer to maybe do both and do a brief compare and contrast to give a sense of the major differences.
Hey, Andrew, on that particular point, so there is a sense within the group that ultimately we would like to see a way to harmonize these two drafts. So it is, I wouldn't necessarily characterize it as a compare and contrast. I would suggest cover what's in each draft sort of neutrally, because understanding that is maybe the important point, because ultimately it's not a this or that choice. It's a, hopefully we harmonize and come up with, because both drafts are now adopted by the working group, which means a couple things for people who aren't familiar with the IETF process. When a working group adopts a draft, it means it's not a commitment that the working group will publish that draft or necessarily adopt what's in that draft as the final result. However, it does mean that the drafts, as they move forward in the process, are subject to the consensus of the working group. So we get rid of authors in the traditional sense of an internet draft, which is just anybody can submit one, and we move to the concept of an editor. And the editor is tasked with the chairs, listening to the consensus of the working group in the updates that are done. So for instance, if let's say somebody decided to submit a pull request that made some radical changes, and somehow somebody accepted that without it actually getting consensus, the response would be we would back that out. And we would go back to what did have consensus, and we'd build from there. So maybe as part of your introduction, a 5-minute introduction of what it means, for the document stages in the IETF might also be useful for the people listening in, because I do know in the past we probably already see this in other groups where a draft appears.
Okay, José mola un montón.
Bear with me 1 second. Sorry, Glenn, you're
okay. We've seen this where an individual draft appears for a person, and suddenly a lot of emails start flying around saying, oh my gosh, the IETF decided to do X, Y, and Z. And we all have to send out that email saying, no, it's just a proposal for one person or a group of people. It's not an adopted RFC. And that's way down the road.
Yeah, so good point. So a combination of both explaining the key points of the two drafts, as well as explaining the stage that they're now at and how they will move forward. And it looks like it looks like Jim's putting his hand up to volunteer to do exactly that. So you're going to jump in then, Jim, to confirm?
I'm definitely not volunteering. Should know better than that, Andrew. My point was just something that Glenn said a moment ago made the back of my hair stick out. Glenn talked about discussions being made or decisions being made on the basis of PRs in the GitHub repository. I'm sure he didn't mean that.
Okay, I missed that particular point, but I don't think Glenn.
Glenn was talking about when documents get adopted as working group documents, and then went on to mention the idea that something might be resolved or discussed inside a PR request on GitHub. And that's not how we decide things. At least that's not how I hope we decide things.
No, so Jim, if you heard that I misspoke, because my intention is the discussions take place on the list. And while discussions do take place in the pull request, ultimately the consensus discussions have to take place on the list. That's where they belong. I'm not deviating from that.
Yeah.
So,
thank you for that, Glenn. I'm very concerned about this because I don't see any of the emails coming out from GitHub. So whenever anything's done on these PRs, I don't get to see them.
okay, let me take a look at that. We've tried to set up the GitHub repositories to drop emails to the list on a weekly basis to summarize what's been going on there, just so that it's not done in isolation. Let me recheck that to make sure that that's configured correctly, and that's being sent out.
Okay, thanks, Glenn.
Brilliant. Okay, a good point of clarification. The one other point I'll mention, and I just check if anybody else had anything that they picked up on, was, of course, in addition to those two proposals, another one that was discussed was, in fact, a proposal that supported split DNS, sort of split horizon DNS for enterprise configurations, which I think was also a very positive sort of development that's now at least in draft form as a proposal. So we're starting to, across the different proposals, cover the bulk of user requirements, although, as Glenn said, whether there's an opportunity just to knit some of those together is something to be explored. Now, before we move on, does anyone else who attended those two working group sessions have anything else they wanted to comment on or highlight that they picked up on? I'll give you a moment to say so if not. And I'm seeing a few comments in the chat, but I don't think they're questions, more so sort of amplifying some of the things we said. So yeah, that's fine. Okay, let's then maybe just briefly consider some of the other sessions, and I'll call these out and remind you why I put them on there, just to see if anybody else attended these, and if you had any observations you also wanted to make. So these are in the order I wrote them down, which is sort of roughly in the chronological order that these came up throughout the week. So the first one that I noted of interest was within the IETF open meeting, was what I found to be a very interesting presentation on well, this long form sort of heading was cache snooping rare domains at large public DNS resolvers, which I won't attempt to explain because it was a longish presentation, but I have asked its author if she might wish to join us one week to reprise the key components of it, not the whole thing, because I suspect it will be of interest to some of the resolver operators on here. Jim, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, just a couple of points. I agree with you, it was an interesting talk. You can pick it up on YouTube because the presentation was pre-recorded and Audrey was actually taking questions as the video was being played during the IETF open session. I understand that she's been approached by RIPE and possibly DNSOARC as well. So there's a good chance she'll be repeating her presentations at both of those upcoming meetings. Can't guarantee that, but just watch this space. So that might be a chance for some of the people on the call here that if they want to have further conversation with Audrey, that might be another opportunity for them.
Yeah, good point. And you're right, I'd forgotten the format, which was quite interesting, as you say, which The two presentations at the IETF open session were both pre-recorded, and the presenters were therefore able to respond live to questions in the chat whilst they were separately running the sort of presentation on the video, which was quite a time efficient way of doing it, I thought. Well, as Jim said, yes, potentially that may well then appear on a few other venues, and I'll let you know if Audrey agrees to join our call, principally to focus on the sort of end of a presentation and potentially take questions rather than reprise the whole thing, which you can watch the video for that if required. Okay, I also sort of joined the measurement and analysis for protocols MapRG group, which included a presentation on measuring DOT and the privacy benefits of encrypted DNS. Again, which I thought was an interesting presentation. Starting I think a useful discussion there, and there's a bit of a theme with this and a few others that we maybe come on to, just looking at sort of how things are working. I don't know if anyone else that's on the call joined that, and if you had any observations, but I'd certainly suggest that it's worthwhile watching the recording of that if you didn't have a chance to see it during the meeting itself. And as I say, in fact, I'll just put it back in the chat for those of you that joined a few minutes late. The links to all of these you can either find on the IETF website very easily, or if you're not familiar with that, I'll just post a link to the page where all I've done is just to put the sort of list of titles and the links to the relevant material that the IETF site also links to. Just for your reference. Moving on, the TLS working group had quite a longish discussion on progress with Encrypted Client Hello, ECH, which, to remind you, is the sort of replacement for encrypted SNI. So there was some discussion about sort of dealing with some of the outstanding issues with that. And in case you weren't aware or had forgotten, so interoperability testing is just starting at the moment between some of the interested parties. They've sort of frozen the development. It was going to be draft 09. It's actually frozen draft 10 to enable the interoperability testing to take place. And I know a number of companies are involved in that, including Cloudflare, Mozilla, I think, and various others. So the sort of prove out if interworking is actually a thing with ECH or not, which is obviously going to be quite important for the further development of the standard. So if you have an interest in encrypted SNI, then that is worth looking out for. And I'll just plow on a little, but please put your hands up or put comments in the chat if anyone has so wants to jump in. The sort of deprive session covered a number of topics likely to be of interest to this group, including DNS over QUIC, which we've talked about previously on this call, Oblivious DO, which again we've also talked about briefly before on this call, and authoritative DNS encryption, which essentially is encrypting, putting encryption in place between the recursive and the authoritative resolvers. It sounded to me as if some progress was being made in all three areas. I think particular appetite on Oblivious DO, some discussion still continuing both in the working group sort of discussion at IETF, but also on the mailing list. around the right way to go forward on the authoritative DNS encryption. So I think there are some differing, strongly held views there. So that debate, I no doubt, will move on for a while. But on Oblivious DOE, I certainly came away with the impression that was making more rapid progress. I don't know if anybody else joined that session. Yeah, Ian. Well, maybe you did, maybe you didn't, or you have a question. So jump in.
I have a question. So on Oblivious DOE, have they looked at it in relation to the kinds of requirements that we've been considering with respect to normal DOE in terms of network-based security, or are they still assuming that's not a requirement in their domain?
I haven't been following the discussion on the list for deprived so closely on this, so I'll put that important health warning. Granted, there was a lot of content covered last week. I don't recall that coming up particularly strongly during the working group session. I don't know if anybody else that happened to join that session, if you picked up any differently on that, or alternatively noted anything differently on the deprived mailing list, but it isn't something that I recall from last week. So just pause and see if anybody signals that they thought differently momentarily, and if not, so Ian, yeah, good question. I don't, at the moment, I don't think so, and I think there is an appetite to move forward with Oblivious DOE, not least of which because it's viewed as a subset of something which is also a work in progress, to come on to in a second, which is Oblivious HTTPS. So it's maybe moving slightly more quickly than Oblivious HTTPS, but the view is that could almost be absorbed in due course by that as a development. Glenn?
Hang on, I'm pushing buttons here. So I would really encourage people who haven't looked at those two proposals to really give them a good look. They're very interesting proposals. They do shake up, especially the Oblivious DNS. It is a very significant change to how DNS resolution is done today, and may have some significant operational and performance impacts to the world we live in already. And so, you know, sometimes we get really focused on certain topics, like how do we do, you know, DNS discovery. I think those other two topics are something that people really should take a good look at this point, when they're sort of in their inchoate formation stage, somewhat, and really put some, you know, thought into it, because otherwise we'll be here, you know, 18 months from now going, oh my gosh, I can't believe somebody thought we should do that operationally, you know, because we didn't have it on the radar. So strong suggestion is, put it on the radar, please, right now, everybody.
Yeah, fair comment, Glenn. Thank you. And I can see, I'll read these out from the chat, and then I'll come to Chris next. So I can see Pat has commented firstly in the chat, just welcoming a view from anyone on the incentives of running an Oblivious, either Oblivious DOE or Oblivious HTTP proxy, given the existing models of the web around things like advertising and such like. So what will be the incentive to run an Oblivious proxy? Should anyone have any thoughts? And that did come up, as I recall, in the working group session. There were a few questions around, so what were the incentives other than altruism for doing that? And Jason, sorry, that's Jason has a technical problem, which I will see if I can resolve separately. But Jason, if you want to raise your hand, just by, oh, okay, you had the same question as Pat. Fine. So by all means, anyone that can't raise your hand for whatever reason, feel free just to write hand raise in the chat, and I will see that. But in the meantime, thanks. Chris, you wanted to jump in.
Yes, just I think I agree with Glenn. I mean, yeah, it's definitely something people should be aware of. I mean, because the reason the whole issue with DOH blew up in the first place was because the deployment model that was first used essentially cut out the network's designated resolver from the loop, and the encrypted DNS. The DNS queries were tunneled out to someone on the internet. Oblivious DNS does essentially the same thing. So it's the network's local resolver is still being used, but it has no ability to understand the queries. So essentially it's cut out of the loop. And therefore all the impacts that were identified, or most of them at least, that were identified from the use of DOH to a cloud service are likely to also apply to Oblivious DNS. So obviously the key thing here is the choice of the client as to how it makes its queries. You know, if it's, I guess there needs to be, what we're looking for here is a way for a sensible choice to be made on the client about when to use which technology and towards which resolver.
Yeah, well, I think those are good points, Chris. And I can see Pat has commented in the chat that it pushes the need for a user to trust even more parties. And I think one of the challenges for Oblivious, whether it's DOH or HTTPS, is you're trusting that the proxy that you use is not colluding with the endpoint that it connects to, which I think is potentially a weakness, that they could potentially be the same party. And how would you as a user know that? I don't know what mechanisms they've put in place to ensure that doesn't happen, but which is all the more reason, going back to Glenn's point, if people have concerns, to familiarize themselves with the proposals and then make comments on them whilst they're still at the stage where they could be molded or changed. Glenn.
Well, one final question I do have, and I don't know the answer to this, is given the Oblivious proposals, how you run something like Quick over that, it makes me scratch my head, because Quick is a point-to-point security layer, and how I'm supposed to go through multiple redirecting proxies between me and the answer. I don't know how they're going to make that one work. I'm watching from a technical nerd standpoint, tracking that, going, how's that going to work again?
And it does seem a trend, doesn't it? But there'll be ever more Oblivious X will keep coming. So yeah, and maybe that's next then, Glenn, which will make it exciting. Now, before we move on from that, so with a recommendation for people where that's of interest, to please take a look at the relevant material. I think, Glenn, I don't think you raised your hand again, so let me lower it.
No, I was putting it down.
Okay.
I think we did it at the same time.
We must have done, yes. So it's definitely down now, fine. Before I move on, did anyone else want to jump in that can't raise their hand? Because now will be a good time to do so before I move on to one of the other sessions. I'll take that as not. So for those of you that might have an interest in such things, the IETF plenary session was well attended, as always. Had a discussion around a number of points, some of which I will confess having taken the opportunity to raise there, and I'm looking forward to getting my badge for asking 3 questions in the plenary session. I'm sure there must be an IETF badge or ribbon for something like that. But topics that were discussed included, as we mentioned before, so whether and how the off-list discussions take place with GitHub, and whether more guidance is needed on that. We also I certainly raised the question about whether some of the working groups are perhaps getting rather too many virtual interim sessions and make it very difficult for people to keep up. Some of them, I was in one, I can't remember which one it was, which proposed post IETF 110 that they'll have bi-weekly interim sessions, probably all at the same time of day, which for someone in the wrong time zone will make it extremely disruptive if they've got to disrupt their sleep patterns every 2 weeks for a working group. So we discussed that briefly in the plenary. We also touched on the issue of centralization, which sort of kicked off a bit of a discussion with some of the IAB members. So if any of those topics of interest, by all means, listen to the IETF plenary. Other ones are highlighted by the Privacy Enhancements and Assessments Research Group, which is part of the IETF, which if you missed it, you'll be delighted to know that they talked about IP address privacy, which I did suggest. Yes, fortnightly, sorry, bi-weekly will be an alternate word for fortnightly. So go back to the PEARG. They did discuss IP address privacy. So for those of you that are struggling with DNS encryption, at least at the research level, they're starting to give some thought to what they can do to obscure or not use the IP address. So if that's of interest, that's a session well worth catching up on. I don't recall there being a great many network operators in that, so be that ISPs or indeed enterprise operators. So I'd urge you, if that's the sort of pigeonhole you're in particular, to take a look at that and consider the ramifications. And then look at the last two in the Internet Area Working Group. Amongst other presentations, Tommy Pawley, who many of us will know, gave a presentation on per application networking considerations and how the applications could sort of signal their needs to a network. So that may well be something worth you touching on. Before finally on Privacy Pass, there was a longish discussion around some of the centralization aspects and implications of Privacy Pass. So it was good to see that sort of referring to the discussion in the IAB session only a couple of days previously, and looking at whether there were any meaningful adjustments that could be made to the working group proposals to help mitigate the risk of centralization. Now, I went through those last two quite rapidly. I don't know if anybody else who's on the call had any comments on any of those, other than whether you should use the words bi-weekly or fortnightly, as noted in the chat. Jim?
Thanks, Andrew. There was another point which I think will need attention in the future. There's nothing that's going to crop up really soon now, but I think it could be significant. In DNSOC, Gary Arco introduced a draft where he's proposing use of trusted execution environments for DNS resolution. So this document is just going to be sort of bouncing around the IETF for a while until it finds a home. I suspect it will probably come back to DNSOC once it's gone to PRG and one or two other places or not. Now, my understanding of trusted execution environments is that this is going to become a black box. And Yari said when he was introducing the document, the intention is to protect user data when it's in transit, in use, and at rest. So I think the clear intention at this stage essentially is to make the entire DNS transaction end-to-end being completely opaque to an outside party. So there'll be no logs, there'll be nothing, because it'll all be done inside these trusted execution environment containers. Now, again, I believe these trusted execution environments are still not ready for prime time. There is some experimental hardware out there, but if this stuff does become more mainstream, this could well become a concern in a few years' time. Obviously, first of all, is find a home for this in the IETF, work it through to some kind of RFC, but at the same time, if the hardware is maturing and there's more interest in this kind of stuff, I think this is potentially going to be a greater concern in the long run if people are minded to implement and deploy it.
Yeah.
But just keep an eye on this for the future.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I forgot. I did see sitting on that session, and yeah, you're right. I mean, I think there are a few practical considerations to be resolved on that, but yeah, it certainly does have some medium-term implications, definitely. And I see Chris has raised his hand. I don't know, Chris, if it was in response to that topic in particular.
Yeah. I'm interested that Jim had a different initial reaction to Yari's presentation, because I saw it a different way, which is, in a lot of these activities in the internet, there's massive focus on encrypting data in transit and obscuring it from any parties in the middle, but there's an awful lot of data collected at the endpoints, and that it, for example, it funds the advertising model of the internet, and so when Jerry says, well, we should also focus on protecting data at rest rather than just in transit, my initial thought was, well, yes, clearly that's a worthwhile thing. Otherwise, we're just ignoring the elephant in the room. But I don't know what the scope of that is in terms of, does it prevent all kinds of logging and supervision, whatever? But just the basic concept seemed to me to make some sense.
Yeah, and certainly Yari, I know in the past, in his paper on centralization, did highlight the need to consider the full security model, and as you say, the endpoints, not just the network, when considering the potential security risks. So yeah, this is obviously development of that thinking. Okay, thanks, Chris. Did anyone have any other sessions that you sort of joined that you thought worthy of highlighting that may be of interest to others in this group? Again, I'll give you a moment to pause and think about that. If not, it sounds like those of you that weren't able to join last week, or only for one or two sessions, then perhaps with the addition of the sort of DNS op working group session, which I must admit I'd forgotten about that one. You can maybe use the list as circulated as a good place to start to get a flavour of some of the more sort of directly relevant sessions from the perspective of things most likely to be of interest to people more focused on DNS related matters. So hopefully that is useful and will save a little bit of time. So in the last minute or so, so we're running well to time, did anyone have anything else that they wished to raise whilst we're gathered on the call this week? Give you a moment to think if there is. Whilst you're thinking, I'll remind you that next week we've got a sort of a presentation lined up on some of the trade-offs with privacy to grossly do not do justice to the material that I think will be sort of presented with our two guest speakers. So it would be a contrast to the discussion with the IETF focus this week. But with that in mind, if anyone's got any good ideas for some people that might be able to help with the how to helpfully sort of summarize the key facets of DDR and the DNR drafts for the uninitiated. Please message me directly on those if you do, and I'll be delighted to sort of explore with people offline, and we'll get that scheduled in the next few weeks as well, to ensure everyone's up to speed and better able to take part in those discussions. So on that point, if nobody's got anything else to add, thanks everyone. I hope that was useful. Have a fantastic week, and see you again this time next week. Enjoy your week, everyone. Thanks for your time.